Hi, my name is Vedika.
My name is Kana.
My name is Jahisha.
And my name is Ria. This video will discuss civil rights in America from 1961 through 1969.
American and national identity.
During the Civil Rights Movement, American identity was in a tenuous spot, with African Americans fighting to be regarded as equal to white Americans. This helped shape not only the identity of Black people, but also that of American youth. It was young people that truly embraced the struggle for social justice and fought against racism, as well as poverty, war, and censorship. The SNCC, or Student Non-Violating Coordinating Committee, coordinated peaceful protests against segregation. Students were also responsible for staging numerous sit-ins at segregated lunch counters. They wanted to increase Black political power in the South, and so would walk around Southern towns encouraging Black people to register to vote. It was these students that would grow up to form the New Left. In March 1965, Martin Luther King Jr. led a group of nonviolent demonstrators, including the SNCC and Southern Christian Leadership Council, to the Capitol in Montgomery, Alabama, in order to register Black voters in the South. Known as Bloody Sunday because police officers hit people with clubs and used tear gas, the incident was televised and raised awareness about voting rights.
The Congress of Racial Equality recruited civil rights activists, and on May 4, 1961, they pursued freedom rides, traveling through the American South in order to protest segregation in interstate bus terminals. A mixed group of both Black and white activists would go to segregated areas and use the facilities designated for the opposite race. While their buses were often set on fire and riders beaten, they gained international attention. By 1961, the Interstate Commerce Commission, or the ICC, issued regulations prohibiting segregation in bus and train stations nationwide.
The unity that activists had displayed with the freedom rides would be required throughout the rest of the movement as well, among both Blacks and whites. The March on Washington would test this. By this point, there was a lot of division within the movement. Some believed that Kennedy's newly proposed civil rights bill wasn't radical enough, while others, like Martin Luther King Jr., encouraged these small steps. Despite these inner tensions, however, activists united and marched in Washington Mall to express support for the new bill as well as discuss needs for economic equality. The event culminated with King's famous "I Have a Dream" speech.
This nation will rise up, live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created.
Freedom Summer was another example of unity among activists. It was a voter registration project in Mississippi held by white and Black student activist groups. In the process, 2 white students were murdered, which only served to reiterate the urgency of the pending civil rights bill.
To protest racial segregation, the SCLC launched a campaign in Birmingham, Alabama. Eugene Bull Connor, the Public Safety Commissioner in Birmingham, used fire hoses and brutal force to subdue this public demonstration. Pictures of such police brutality were viewed across the nation, evoking both sympathy and horror. MLK was arrested during this campaign, and while he was in jail, he wrote the letter from Birmingham jail. These letters addressed racial injustice and paved the way for the Civil Rights Act. It shaped national identity as the entire nation came to realize the extent of segregation in the South.
Politics and power.
In the election of 1960, the presidential race between Republican Richard Nixon and Democrat John F. Kennedy took place. Kennedy won the election by a very slim margin. This would not push for civil rights as emphatically as many had hoped. Reluctant to alienate conservative Southern Democrats in Congress, Kennedy refused to push for civil rights legislation. Instead, he appointed many African Americans to high-level positions and strengthened the Civil Rights Commission.
However, violence in the nation was erupting and tensions threatened the nation's security. In 1962, Kennedy ordered U.S. Marshals to protect James Meredith. He was the first Black student to attend the University of Mississippi, causing white mobs to attack him. Kennedy was forced to subdue the white mobs with the use of marshals. Then, in June 1963, civil rights leader Medgar Evers was murdered in Mississippi. Consequently, Kennedy gave the civil rights address calling for unity in what he now called a moral issue.
Then, on November 22, 1963, Kennedy was assassinated. Lyndon B. Johnson, a Southerner from Texas, assumed presidency. As a great supporter of civil rights, Johnson would go on to pass many important legislations, including the Civil Rights Act, which ended discrimination based on race and gender, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which allowed the federal government to oversee voter registration in counties where African American registration was low. By also outlawing literacy tests and poll taxes, this act increased the number of black votes. In 1967, Johnson would also appoint the first African American Supreme Court Justice, Thurgood Marshall.
As the civil rights movement was gaining traction, some activists pushed for power as well as rights. In 1964, a rallying cry for Black Power was heard in order to fight poverty and substandard housing. This culminated into the Black Panthers Party. This revolutionary political party used aggressive rhetoric and strong self-defense. As confrontational activities increased, the civil rights movement took a turn, and people like Malcolm X advocated for black separatism.
In the election of 1964, Republican Barry Goldwater and Lyndon B. Johnson were vying for the position. Goldwater opposed the Civil Rights Bill and the Social Security system. He believed that individual liberty was more important than equality. Johnson, on the other hand, was an avid supporter of civil rights. This created tension with the Southern Democrats as the Democratic Party was exclusively white. This tension culminated at the 1964 Democratic National Convention. The Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, a racially mixed delegation, was acknowledged by Johnson. Although he lost their support when trying to compromise with the Southern white representatives, Johnson would go on to win the election in a landslide. From there, he launched his plan of the Great Society, calling for the elimination of poverty and racial injustice.
Work, exchange, and technology.
The 1960s would revolutionize TV and would be the first time a presidential debate would be televised. Kennedy, more comfortable in the front of the camera, would eventually win the election against Nixon. This significance of the TV would extend across the civil rights movement as well. By 1960, 90% of Americans had a TV that they used to stay in touch with the movement.
As David Brinkley stated, television showed the American people to the American people, and this allowed them to connect with what was happening in Selma, Montgomery, and all over the country. Americans felt both empathy and horror as they watched the brutality blacks faced, something which many had been unaware of before TV.
Lyndon B. Johnson had his own ideas as to how America should be. He passed many bills to achieve the Great Society, or one with no poverty. Under his administration, poverty in America decreased significantly.
And this administration today, here and now, declares unconditional war on poverty in America.
His efforts to equalize Americans were also in favor of civil rights, and he would take landmark steps towards racial equality.
After the Sputnik was launched, the United States created the National Aeronautic and Space Administration in order to compete with the Soviet Union. Although very few Americans knew at the time, Kennedy had allowed African Americans to take part in the space race effort. NASA hired African American mathematicians, scientists, and engineers to advance in the space race, creating higher-level job opportunities for African Americans. These blacks, including Julius Montgomery, broke color barriers through education and employment.
America in the world.
America maintained its interventionist policies during the 60s in countries such as Cuba. The U.S. broke diplomatic relations with Cuba, and the CIA began its plot to overthrow Castro. However, as the U.S. condemned fascist regimes like Castro's for taking away civil liberties, protests were simultaneously occurring within America itself by civil rights activists. This irony tarnished the reputation of the U.S. as the leading democratic nation. The violence against protesters and at sit-ins during the spring of 1963 received international media coverage, and the Soviet Union pounced on this opportunity. Their propagandist broadcasts argued that capitalism fostered an environment for racism.
As the U.S. tried to support countries in the Third World to achieve Americanized governments, the Soviets spread propaganda to these emerging African, Asian, and South American nations, encouraging them to resist American support. This successfully diverted attention from the Soviets' own treatment of racial minorities and their anti-Semitic policies. Pressure from international media gave the civil rights movement many victories as Kennedy and Johnson passed pro-civil rights legislation, partially to maintain the U.S.'s reputation during the Cold War.
The U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War provoked many activists. Most of the men being drafted came from poor communities, especially those with a high African American population. Many African Americans even volunteered because they believed that the military would be a means of advancement for their race. MLK, however, in a speech known as Beyond Vietnam, called for a truce. He and many other activists did not support the war because they felt that it detracted attention and money away from domestic programs aimed at civil rights. They realized that recruitment propaganda aimed towards minorities gave them a false sense of hope, promising them liberties they never received because most of them would die in battle.
Culture and society.
Youth were particularly influential in the development of American culture during the 60s, and it was through music, television, and books that the civil rights movement empowered these young people and other Americans. Many of them found a place in the hippie movement. These free-thinking young people questioned the status quo, and this was often done by participating in the civil rights movement, which resonated with their values of equality, peace, and love.
Many women also took part in the civil rights movement. Views toward women and sexuality were drastically transformed because of female activists, and in 1963, Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique was credited with sparking feminism. It made women realize that staying at home and looking after their family was not their only purpose. They were empowered to create a sense of self outside of their household, and many did this by fighting for civil rights.
The civil rights movement was also shaped by literature of the decade. For instance, Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird, published in 1960, captured the deep-seated racism of the South in a time when Jim Crow laws still dominated Southern life. Maya Angelou's I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings and Anne Moody's Coming of Age in Mississippi also depicted Southern racism, specifically the racism black girls faced.
The sports industry was also evolving, and baseball was the most popular sport of them all. In 1962, when the first black Major League Baseball player, Jackie Robinson, was inducted into the National Baseball Hall of Fame at Cooperstown, New York, he broke another MLB color barrier, being the first black player to be put in the Baseball Hall of Fame. Music also broke barriers for African American people, and freedom songs often provided an accompaniment to the movement for racial justice. Artists like Aretha Franklin and James Brown instilled pride within the African Americans for their culture. These famous figures inspired blacks and made them believe that they too could achieve greatness.
Migration and settlement.
America's view on immigration and acceptance of immigrants into the country changed drastically as the 1960s rolled around. With Johnson's Great Society came the Immigration Act of 1965, ending all immigration quotas. Immigration surged, and many of these people went to the inner cities, where housing was the cheapest.
As some blacks began to rise in society through education and employment, they began to seek for better neighborhoods to live in. The wealthier blacks wanted their children to have the opportunity to get better education and housing than they had, so they moved into white-dominated streets and cities. This caused what is known as a white flight, in which whites move out of their neighborhoods to flee from the blacks moving in. Whites did not want to be associated with the blacks, even if they were educated.
Besides inner-city living, most of the middle class and upper class with white-collar jobs lived in suburbs. Suburbs were created on the outskirts of extremely industrialized and populated cities such as Los Angeles, Chicago, and New York City. This led to continued segregation in housing, as most African Americans were forced to live in ghettos, expanding these urban areas that had been developing in the past decade.
Environment and geography.
African Americans mostly used peaceful protests to win their civil rights, but as time went on, they became impatient, losing hope for liberal reform. It was in the cities, where the population was large and the concentration of minorities high, that the loss of hope turned into violent race riots.
In Harlem, for example, when a white police officer shot a black teenager, aggressive protesters moved the Corps' planned peaceful protest to the police station, where violence broke out. In the next few months, murder, fighting, and arson would become common to Harlem. Similar riots would break out across the country in places like Watts and Chicago, places with high minority concentrations.
Geography also affected race riots in the sense that Northern blacks could not understand why Southern blacks would only peacefully protest. The North never had the Jim Crow laws that had dictated the South. Southerners, like King, knew that change could not be made unless they gained support from the world and from the whites in America who sympathized the pitiful image of peaceful blacks being attacked by violent whites.
For this reason, Northerners mainly encouraged violent race riots, while Southerners, like the SCLC, promoted nonviolent boycotts and protests. However, the King assassination riots occurred nationwide. The assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. on April 4, 1968, would cause riots in hundreds of cities in what was known as the Holy Week Uprising. His death led to anger and hopelessness among blacks and made them feel that violence was the only way to gain equality.